The orders were already sealed when I walked into the chamber. That is how I knew they were not asking. Elder Saran stood at the head of the long obsidian table, his hands folded in that particular way that meant the decision had been made 3 days ago, and this meeting was theater. The air in the chamber tasted of ozone and recycled certainty. 7 council members, 7 pairs of eyes watching me cross the floor. The bioelectric field in the room pressed against my skin like warm static. Guilt, mostly, with a thin edge of apology nobody planned to voice. I am Kethari. We do not read minds. We read fields, the low electrical current that every living body generates, the one that shifts and stutters with every emotion a person tries to hide. Humans call it instinct when they catch a fragment of it. We were born fluent in it. The field in that chamber was loud with things nobody was saying. I stopped at the required distance from the table and waited. Elder Saran unfolded his hands and picked up the document. It was a physical document. That was the first sign of how serious this was. The council only printed things on physical paper when they wanted no record in the network. When they wanted the decision to exist only in the room and in the body of whoever was being handed it. He began to read. I watched his field instead of his face. The treaty terms were straightforward in the way that only deeply unfair things manage to be straightforward. 1 Kethari diplomatic liaison, military caste, full security clearance. 1 human military attaché of equivalent rank. Joint assignment. Frontier post at the edge of the Veth corridor, which was a polite name for the stretch of space where 3 territorial claims overlapped, and none of them were willing to blink first. 18 standard months. Full cooperative protocol. Cooperative protocol. The words sat in my chest like a stone someone had dropped there from a height. Elder Saran finished reading and looked at me over the document. I asked if the assignment was punitive. He said no. His field said yes, and also said he was sorry, and also said he did not think sorry was a word I wanted from him, which was the most accurately he had read me in 11 years of council service. I reached out and took the document from his hand. I did not look at any of the 7 faces. I folded the paper, carefully, evenly, pressing each crease with the flat of my thumb until the geometry was exact, and I held it at my side, and I said that I would report to the transit station within the standard window. He nodded. I left. The corridor outside the chamber was long and white and very quiet. My footsteps did not echo. Kethari architecture absorbs sound the way it absorbs light, efficiently and without sentiment. I walked at a measured pace because I was in a building full of people who would read my pace and draw conclusions from it, and I did not feel like being a conclusion anyone drew that afternoon. I had known the frontier posting was coming. Not this specifically, not the human element, but the general shape of it, the sense that the council was running out of moves and running out of the kind of pride that keeps you from making uncomfortable ones. The war with the Dravathi was not going well. It was not going catastrophically, which was how command preferred to describe it, but I had read enough fields in enough briefing rooms to know the difference between not catastrophic and actually fine, and we were firmly in the former. The Kethari needed allies. The humans had shown, at Kareth Corridor 14 months ago, that they were the specific kind of ally worth having, not because they were strategic, not because their technology was superior, because when the corridor was about to fall and every calculation said to pull back and cut losses, 12 human soldiers had held the line for 19 hours with equipment that was, by any reasonable standard, not enough. 47 Kethari had been behind that line. 47 who came home because 12 humans had decided that the math of the situation was not a thing they were willing to accept. I passed the memorial wall without slowing down. Names etched in pale stone, 2 columns, Kethari on the left, human on the right. I did not need to read them. I had memorized all 59 the week after the engagement, in the quiet of my quarters, with the lights low, which is the closest thing I have ever come to what humans call prayer. I kept walking. The treaty document was folded in my hand, its edges perfect, its geometry faultless, and I pressed it a little tighter because that was the only thing I had available to press. 18 months. I had served 11 years in the diplomatic military caste. I had been assigned to 4 frontier posts, 3 negotiation details, and 1 situation that was supposed to be a negotiation detail and turned into something I still filed under classified in the part of my memory I do not open during work hours. I had coordinated with 7 different species. I had learned 4 languages well enough to argue in them, and 2 more well enough to insult someone and make it sound like a compliment. I had never been assigned to work alongside a human, not closely, not in the sustained, confined, operationally dependent way that cooperative protocol implied. What I knew about humans, I knew from briefings and from the Kareth Corridor Memorial, and from the bioelectric static that rolled off them in waves whenever one was in the same room, chaotic, disorganized, loud in the way that a frequency jammed against itself is loud, all signal and no coherence. Cathari read fields the way others read faces. It is not mystical, it is biological. The low electrical current that every living body generates shifts with every emotion. Fear sharpens it, grief flattens it. Deception creates a specific stuttering pattern I can identify at 3 meters. We are not reading minds, we are reading the body's honest report of what the mind is trying to hide. Humans were the only species I had ever encountered whose fields I could not parse. They were not suppressed, not blocked, they were simply disorganized in a way that my biology had no template for. Standing near a human felt like trying to listen to a conversation through a wall that was also, somehow, on fire. I found it unpleasant. I found it, if I was being precise in the privacy of my own mind, unsettling in a way that had nothing to do with culture or politics, and everything to do with the fact that I had spent my entire career knowing things before people said them. Not knowing felt like a room with no floor. I reached my quarters and set the folded document on the table beside the door. I stood in the center of the room. The walls were the color of deep water, which I had chosen myself 7 years ago when I moved in, and have never once reconsidered. I looked at the document. Then I picked it up and refolded it. The first fold had a crease that was 2 degrees off from true. I pressed it flat, reset the geometry, and folded it again. Then again, because the second attempt had a slight unevenness on the right edge that I was not willing to accept. The third fold was correct. I set it down. I stood very still. Then I opened my mission kit and began to pack. Outside the transit window, the void was doing what it always did. Nothing, beautifully, in all directions. I watched it for a long time that night, sitting on the edge of my bunk with my hands resting still in my lap, which is the Cathari position for thinking that you do not want anyone to see you doing. I was not afraid of the assignment. That would be imprecise. What I had was something closer to the feeling of watching a door open onto a room you have never been in, knowing you cannot see the floor before you step, knowing you will step anyway because someone sealed your orders 3 days ago and printed them on paper. The human soldier was already at the posting. I had read the file. Sergeant Don Morrow, 29 years, Midwestern origin on the North American continent, 6 years of active service, 3 frontier engagements. Commendations I recognized the weight of. Medical notes I read twice. No flags, no incidents outside combat parameters. Evaluation scores that told me he was good at his work without telling me anything about what kind of person did that work. Files never did. I closed my eyes. I thought about the memorial wall. I thought about 12 soldiers in 19 hours and 47 names I would carry longer than I would carry most things. I thought 18 months. Then I thought about the folded document on the table, its geometry finally correct, and I let myself have the small satisfaction of that before I let myself sleep. In the morning, I filed my departure report, listed my assignment under the operational code that meant Joint Diplomatic Security Detail, and walked out of the building without looking at the memorial wall. I did not need to look. I had already looked, in every way that counted. I carried it with me instead, which is the only honest thing to do with the weight of names you cannot put down. The transit took 9 days. 9 days of narrow corridors and recycled air and the low thrum of an engine that I had cataloged by the end of day 2. I ate at the same time each day. I reviewed mission parameters. I ran through the cooperative protocol document until I could have recited it in my sleep, which I possibly did, because my dreams during those 9 days had the same flat procedural quality as government documentation. I did not let myself think too far ahead. That had always been my discipline. Do not build the room before you walk into it, because you will build it wrong, and then you will have to unlearn it, and unlearning is more expensive than arriving without expectations. I told myself I had no expectations. I told myself it was just another posting. I refolded the treaty document once more on day 7, because the humidity in the transit ship had done something to the paper that bothered me, and the geometry needed resetting. It took 4 attempts to get it right. I did not examine what that meant. I set it down, pressed the crease with my thumb, and went back to reading the mission parameters. 18 months. Frontier post. 1 human soldier. Fine. It would be fine. The station was smaller than the file had suggested, which was either an error in the documentation or an optimistic assessment by whoever wrote it, and I had been in the diplomatic caste long enough to know it was the latter. It sat at the edge of the Veth corridor like something someone had bolted to the dark and hoped for the best. Functional, gray, exactly as comfortable as a place that was built for watching and waiting, and not much else. I came through the docking port with my 2 cases and my mission kit and the folded treaty document tucked in the inner pocket of my jacket, and I stood in the receiving bay and let my field sense expand into the space the way I always did when I entered a new environment, reading the room before anyone could tell me about it. The station was mostly quiet. 3 Cathari maintenance staff, their fields low and professional, 2 automated systems running their cycles, a food dispensary that needed servicing, and 1 human, outside, on the hull observation deck, whose bioelectric field came through the external bulkhead as a dense low hum that immediately separated itself from everything else in my awareness. I stood still for a moment. The field was not loud. That was the first thing that was wrong. Every human field I had ever encountered in a briefing room or at a diplomatic function had been loud, scattered, and electric, and full of conflicting frequencies the way a crowd is full of conflicting voices. This one was low and dense and organized in a way I had no template for. Not organized like a Cathari field, which runs in clean parallel channels that are simple to read. Organized the way a very old building is organized. Settled, load-bearing in ways you cannot identify until you remove a wall and realize you should not have. I made a note of it. I did not examine it further. I picked up my cases and went to find the exterior deck. He was leaning on the railing, not standing at attention, not waiting with a prepared posture. Leaning, 1 forearm on the rail, looking out at the corridor stretch beyond the station's lights. He was taller than the file suggested. Files always flatten people, and he wore his uniform the way people wear things they have worn long enough to stop thinking about. He heard me come through the deck door. He turned. I recited the formal greeting in standard Cathari, then in Federation Common, then in the secondary human dialect most frequently used in frontier postings. 3 languages, appropriate tone, correct diplomatic framing. I had practiced the sequence. He listened to all 3. Then he said, "Valeth, got it. I'm Don. Not Sergeant Morrow. Don." As if we were 2 people meeting in a corridor, somewhere rather than a formally assigned cooperative unit with specific protocol requirements. I explained the rank protocol. He listened with the particular quality of attention that meant he was actually listening and not simply waiting for me to finish, which I noticed because it was not what I expected. He nodded when I was done. He said, "Fair enough." I explained that I would not be socializing outside operational hours, that my cultural requirements included a minimum personal space radius of 2 arm lengths in non-tactical situations, and that I would expect adherence to the mission documentation timeline that I had already uploaded to the station's shared drive. He listened to all of that too. He said, "Fair enough." Then he reached into the side pocket of his jacket, pulled out a ration packet, and held it out toward me. I looked at it. It was a standard field ration, the human variety, which I recognized from supply manifests if not from personal experience. He was holding it in a way that was not demanding, not performing, just holding it out. The way you hold something out to someone when you notice they have been traveling for 9 days, and you happen to have a spare. I did not take it. He set it down on the railing beside me, and went back to looking at the corridor. His field did not spike with offense, did not shift with irritation or disappointment. It stayed exactly as it was, low, dense, that organized hum that my field sense kept returning to, the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. Not painful, just present. I stood at the required distance and I watched the corridor, and I tried not to notice that I was noticing the field. We stood out there for 11 minutes without speaking. In my experience, 11 minutes of silence between two people who have just met is either hostile or comfortable, and the precise indicator is whether the silence feels like a wall or like a room. This felt like a room. I did not know what to do with that. In the following days, I learned the station the way I learned every assignment, systematically, from the maintenance logs outward. I cataloged the equipment inventory, the communication systems, the power cycling schedule, the weak points in the external sensor array that I flagged for repair in a formal report that I filed with both the Cathari Council and the Federation Liaison Office, because cooperative protocol required dual documentation. Don ran his own systems checks in parallel. I discovered this not because he told me, but because I went to run a check on the defensive array and found he had already run it, logged it, and noted 3 of the same weak points I had flagged, plus 1 I had missed, in a format that was compact and precise and completely legible. I filed an internal note that he was thorough. I did not attach any further assessment to this. We ate at different times, initially. This was practical. The galley was small, and 2-arm distance was difficult to maintain in it, and I had structured it that way deliberately. He did not comment on the schedule. He simply worked around it, which was either considerate or so indifferent to my presence that he had not noticed the arrangement. I was not sure which. On the 4th day, I was reviewing the external communication logs in the operations room when he came in to run a frequency calibration on the long-range array. He worked at the far console. I worked at mine. The room was small enough that the 2-arm distance was theoretical rather than actual. We were perhaps 3 feet apart, which was within the margin I had defined as the boundary of comfortable operational proximity. His field was right there, dense and low, and doing that thing it did where it did not scatter the way human fields were supposed to scatter. I kept my eyes on my screen. I ran through the communication logs with more attention than they required. After 20 minutes, he said, without looking up from his calibration, "You're working the log archive. You want me to pull the last 6 months of frequency data so you can cross-reference?" I paused. He had identified what I was doing from the pattern of my work without asking, without looking, apparently from the peripheral awareness of someone who had been paying quiet attention. The cross-reference would have taken me 2 additional hours to request through the system. With his pull, it would take 8 minutes. I said that would be acceptable. He pulled the data and routed it to my console without comment. I cross-referenced it in 6 minutes, because I worked faster when I was slightly unsettled and did not want to examine why. "Thanks," he said, when I filed the completed report. I said it was standard cooperative protocol. He said, "Fair enough," and went back to his calibration. That evening, I reorganized the shared equipment manifest. It had already been organized. Don had set it up on day 2 in a format that was functional and clear. I reorganized it anyway, into the Cathari cataloging system, which was more precise. It took 2 hours. When I was done, I stood and looked at it and then, very deliberately, converted it back to his format with my additions integrated, because his format was actually easier to navigate in low-light tactical conditions, and I was not willing to let my own system preferences compromise operational function. I filed it under Joint Organizational Framework in the shared drive. He did not comment on it. The next morning, I found that he had added the equipment codes from the maintenance logs, which integrated exactly with the system I had built. Neither of us said anything about it. On the 9th day, I was in the corridor outside the operations room, reviewing the weak sensor data on my handheld unit, when he came around the corner and stopped at a respectful distance, not 2 arm lengths, slightly less, but with the body language of someone who had chosen the distance consciously rather than defaulted to it. He said, "Question, not operational." I looked up from the unit. He said, "The memorial wall at the council complex. Were any of the names people you knew?" The field off him was doing something I could not classify. Not shifting the way a field shifts with a manipulative question, the specific stutter pattern of someone who wants a particular answer and is working toward it. It was level. The question was genuine. The field behind it was, I did not know the word for it. The closest I could find was patient. I said that the Cathari did not know people the way humans meant the word. That Cathari relationships in the military caste were organized around function and trust built through shared operation, not through the personal category humans called knowing. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Fair enough." And then he walked past me toward the galley, and I stood in the corridor with the sensor data I had stopped reading, and this time when he said "fair enough," the field behind it was different, and I could not tell you how, and I could not tell you why that distinction sat in my chest the way it did. I looked down at the sensor data. I looked at it for a long time without processing any of it. On the 13th day he knocked on the frame of the operations room door, which he always did even though the door was open, and said, "You eat dinner yet?" I said I had not scheduled it yet. He said, "Galley's free." He walked away without waiting for a response, which should have been the end of it. I sat with my report for 4 more minutes and then I went to the galley and ate dinner at the same time he did, at opposite ends of the small table, with the station's external cameras cycling through their rotation on the wall screen between us. We did not talk. The field in the room was as low and organized as it always was when he was nearby, and I ate my meal and did not examine that, and somewhere around the midpoint of dinner, I realized I had stopped counting the distance between us. I did not remark on this. I finished my meal. I washed my dish. I went back to my report. I did not reorganize anything that night. There was nothing that needed it. But I almost did, twice, and that was something I noticed without having anywhere to put it. The ration packet from the first day was still on the railing outside. It had been there for 13 days. The exterior of the station maintained stable temperature, so it was still good. The next morning I went out to check the sensor relay and I brought it back inside. I told myself it was a waste of resources to leave it out there. I told myself that twice, walking back in from the deck. The alert came in at 0340, which is the hour that exists for nothing good. I was already awake. I sleep in 4-hour cycles, which is shorter than human requirement and longer than I need, a compromise my body had reached with Frontier posting schedules years ago. The alert sound was not the standard frequency. It was the one they reserved for contact classification, unknown, approach vector, non-responsive to hail. I was in the operations room in 40 seconds. Don was there in 43, and he had already pulled the sensor feed onto the main screen without stopping to put on his jacket, which meant he had come straight from his bunk, which meant he had been awake too. Neither of us mentioned it. The screen showed 3 contact signatures moving through the outer edge of the corridor in a formation I did not immediately recognize. The Dravathi used triangular approach patterns for their standard scout runs and spiral formations for their engagement groups. This was neither. It was a flat line, which was unusual enough that I ran it through the known formation database twice before accepting that it simply was not in there. Don said, "Flat line approach. They don't want to look aggressive." I said, "Or they are not military." He said, "Same thing out here, different paperwork." He was not wrong. We spent the next 4 hours doing what 2 people do when a situation falls outside the parameters of their briefing, and the nearest command authority is a 9-day transit away. We worked. He ran the communication attempts, cycling through frequencies methodically, the way someone works who has done this before and knows that patience is a tactical position. I ran the sensor analysis, cataloging every reading I could extract from the signatures, cross-referencing with every database I had access to, and two I technically required additional clearance for. The contacts did not respond to hail. They did not change formation. They moved at a pace that was slow enough to be watching and fast enough to be approaching, which is the precise combination designed to make you uncertain about when to act. By morning they had stopped at the outer marker, still in the flat line, still not responding. Don looked at the screen. He looked at it the way he looked at things when he was thinking, not performing thought, just actually doing it, quietly, in that low-field way he had. He said, "They're waiting to see what we do." I said, "Then we wait." He said, "Then we wait," and went to get coffee, which he brought back and set on the console beside my station, without asking if I wanted anything, which I did not, and which I did not say. We waited for 6 hours. The contacts held position. On the 7th hour, one of them broke from the line and began a slow arc toward the station. Not aggressive, exploratory, the movement of something that has decided to find out if you are worth being afraid of. Don said, "That's a scout peel. They're going to probe our sensor range." I said I agreed. I had already adjusted the sensor array to give a read on the scout's signature, without revealing the full extent of our detection capability, which was a standard diplomatic intelligence approach that I had applied before he finished his sentence. He looked at my screen. He saw what I had done. He said, "Nice." That was all. He went back to his own screen. The field off him had a quality in that moment that I filed away because I did not have time to examine it, and because I was not going to examine it in the middle of an active contact situation. The scout probed the sensor range for 3 hours, found the edge we had let it find, and returned to the line. Then all 3 contacts reversed course and began moving back the way they had come. We watched them go. When they cleared the outer marker, Don leaned back in his chair and said, "Good call on the array." I said it was standard procedure. He said, "It was faster than standard procedure." I said I had a good briefing file. He looked at me for a moment. The field off him was level, with that patient quality underneath it. He said, "Right," in a way that meant he did not entirely believe me and was not going to argue about it, which was a combination I found simultaneously irritating and oddly comfortable. I filed the contact report. I sent it up the chain with a full analysis and a recommendation for increased patrol frequency in the outer corridor. I listed the sensor approach as a joint tactical decision, which was generous to me and accurate to him, and which was simply the correct way to document it. That night the Dravathi came back. Not 3 contacts, 11, in a formation I recognized immediately, not from the database, but from the pattern analysis I had been running since the first contact, the shape of their movements, the spacing of their signatures. This was their engagement group formation, modified. They had taken the scouts' data and restructured their approach based on what they thought they knew about our capabilities. What they thought they knew was what we had let them know, which meant they were about to be wrong in a very specific and very useful way. I hit the tactical alarm. Don was already moving by the time the sound reached the corridor. What followed was 3 days. I do not have a cleaner way to say it. It was 3 days of contact rotations, defensive positioning, communication jamming, counter-jamming, power rationing when the Dravathi found a way to spike the outer relay, and one 6-hour stretch where we both worked from the same console because the secondary station had taken a frequency hit that knocked its processing capacity by 40%, and there was no time to reroute it. 6 hours at the same console. The 2-arm distance was not a concept that existed in that space. We worked in the way that people work when the work is the only thing that has a border. His field was right there, constant and low and doing its thing, and I did not have the processing capacity to manage my awareness of it, so I stopped trying and just worked. He made calls I agreed with before I had time to say so. Twice I redirected an approach he had initiated, and both times he adjusted without resistance the moment he saw the sensor data that had informed my redirect, and then he built on the adjustment rather than returning to his original plan, which is a thing that only very confident or very skilled people can do, because everyone else is too attached to being right. At hour 41, he called a flanking approach on the Dravathi outer ring that I had been calculating for 20 minutes but had not yet voiced. He called it in the same window I would have called it in. The same window, not close, the same. I did not say anything about this. I executed the supporting move. It worked. By the end of the third day, the Dravathi had retreated beyond the corridor boundary. Not gone. Out here, nothing was gone. But beyond the boundary. We had held. I filed the engagement report while Don ran a damage assessment of the outer relay. The report took 2 hours because the cooperative protocol required dual documentation, and I was also, in the part of my mind that does not stop even when the rest of me is exhausted, going through every call we had made and examining the ones that had been identical. There were 11 moments in 73 hours of active tactical operation where we had reached the same decision in the same window through separate analysis. I had worked with 11 different partners in my career. I had never had more than 3. I sat with that number for a while. Then I closed the report, filed it, and went to find Don in the equipment bay where he was finishing the damage assessment. I said, "Good call on the flanking approach." He looked up. He said, "Which one?" I said, "Hour 41. He said, "You would have called it." I said, "Yes." He looked at me for a moment. Something moved through his field that I still did not have a template for, still could not parse, still returned to against my will the way a field reader returns to anything that does not resolve cleanly. He said, "Yeah," and went back to the assessment. I stood in the doorway of the equipment bay for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I went to the galley, which is where I went when I needed to do something with my hands that was not work, and I made tea that I did not particularly want, and I stood at the counter and drank it, and thought about 11 out of 11 and what the probability of that was, and came up with a number that was small enough to be interesting. The equipment manifest was perfectly organized. I had reorganized it twice in the last month, and there was genuinely nothing wrong with it. I checked it anyway, found nothing wrong with it, and went to sleep. In the morning, Don said, "You sleep?" I said, 4 hours. He said, "Good," and handed me a ration packet, and I took it, which I had been doing for 3 weeks without making any internal note about the transition from not taking it to taking it, and we went to run the morning systems check together, because after 73 hours of shared tactical operation, running systems checks separately was a redundancy neither of us had mentioned and neither of us had returned to. Outside the station, the corridor was quiet. The Dravathi signatures had cleared the sensor range. The stars were doing what stars do, nothing, beautifully, in all directions. I drank my morning meal beside the sensor console and watched the corridor and felt the low organized hum of Don's field 2 feet to my left and told myself this was simply what operational familiarity felt like. I told myself that with the confidence of someone who is very good at telling themselves things and somewhat less good at believing them. The numbers did not care what I told myself. 11 out of 11 was 11 out of 11, and I had run the probability calculation 3 times in my sleep, apparently, because I woke up with the number already in my head. The number was small enough that I could not file it anywhere comfortable. I left it unresolved and went to check the outer relay, which needed 2 hours of repair work and which I had been looking forward to all morning because repair work required my hands, and my hands were easier to manage than my thoughts that day, and I needed something to be easier. The card game had rules that were, by any objective standard, irrational. There were 4 suits, but only 3 of them mattered in the standard play sequence, and the 4th suit existed primarily to complicate the hand rankings in a way that seemed designed by someone who distrusted simplicity on principle. The point values shifted based on the number of cards remaining in the central pile, which Don called the river, which was not a river by any definition I was familiar with. I won 3 times in a row. He laughed on the 3rd loss, not the polite acknowledgement laugh of someone managing disappointment, but an actual laugh, low and surprised, and the field off him when he laughed was a frequency I had never encountered before in 34 years of reading fields. Something that moved upward, something unguarded. I won the fourth hand and did not say anything because the thing I wanted to say was that the game's irrational structure was actually internally consistent once you identified the underlying logic, which was that the fourth suit functioned as a destabilizer rather than a point generator, and once you mapped its true function, the hand rankings resolved cleanly. But saying that felt like explaining a joke, and explaining a joke kills the thing that made it a joke. So I said nothing, and we played another hand, and he won it, which I allowed because I had already solved the game, and continuing to apply the full solution felt unsporting. He knew I had allowed it. I could tell because his field did not spike with the satisfaction of a genuine win. It had a quality of knowing in it, which on a Cathari field would have read as amusement. I had no template for what it read as on his field. I had stopped needing one, which was a different problem. After the sixth hand, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The operations room was quiet. Second watch rotation, the station running its overnight cycle, the corridor outside a deep and unremarkable dark. He said, "What did you do? Before?" I said, "Before this assignment?" He said, "Before the military." I looked at him. He was still looking at the ceiling, arms crossed loosely, the posture of someone who had asked a question they considered low stakes and genuinely wanted to know the answer to, but was not going to perform wanting to know. I said, "I was in the military." He said, "Same," in the tone of someone who meant, before that was ever a thing you could change, I was already this. I understood this completely. Not because I read it in his field, I did not, but because I recognized it the way you recognize something that is also true of you, before you have words for the recognition. I said, "Same." He nodded once. We did not say anything else about it. The quiet that followed was not empty. It had weight in it, the comfortable weight of two people who have said something real and do not need to expand it. I had experienced this kind of quiet with Cathari colleagues after long operations. I had not expected to experience it here. I did not examine what that meant. I let the quiet sit. We were 2 months into the assignment. I had stopped measuring the two-arm distance at approximately week 4, which I had noted in a private log under operational adjustment, and had not returned to since. The log still had the entry. I had not added anything to it or removed it. He brought me tea in the mornings now. Not every morning. On the mornings when the operations cycle started early, and the galley was occupied with the maintenance staff running their breakfast rotation, he brought 2 cups from the back unit and set one on my console without asking. I had not told him how I took it. He had watched once, early on, and had not needed to watch again. I told myself this was attentiveness, born of operational efficiency. Partners who function well together anticipate each other's needs. This is documented in every cooperative protocol handbook in the Federation, under the section on high-performance unit cohesion. I had read that section many times in my career and never thought about it this specifically before. On a Tuesday, humans named their days, which I had been adapting to because the station ran on human standard chronology. I was in the middle of a communication audit when Don came in from the outer hull inspection and sat down at his console and said, without preamble, "I need you to look at something." He put the hull scan data on the shared screen. There was an anomaly in the outer plating at the aft section, a stress fracture that the automated scan had not flagged because it was below the threshold parameter. Below the threshold, but growing. I could see from the progression pattern that it had been growing for approximately 3 weeks. He had been tracking it for 3 weeks without saying anything, I realized, because he had been waiting to see if it would stabilize, and it had not, and now he was bringing it to me. I said, "This needs a full assessment before the next weather event in the corridor." He said, "Agreed. I've already drafted the repair schedule. I need your sign-off for the resource reallocation." He handed me the tablet. The repair schedule was detailed, conservative, and correct. It accounted for the cooperative protocol documentation requirements I had insisted on in month 1 and had since quietly absorbed into his own filing approach. I signed off. I said the schedule was well constructed. He said, "You would have found it in another 4 days." I said, "Probably 3. He said, "Fair enough," and went back to his console. I held onto the tablet a beat longer than I needed to, and then set it down. Outside the operations room window, the corridor did its slow, quiet nothing. Somewhere beyond our sensor range, the Dravathi were doing whatever the Dravathi did between engagements. I thought about 11 out of 11. I thought about a repair schedule that was filed in my format without being told to use my format. I thought about tea brought without asking, at the right temperature, which I had also never specified. I thought about a field I had been trying to read for 2 months and could not, and had stopped minding the not reading of, which was its own kind of data. There is a Kethari concept, I do not know if humans have a word for it, called settled frequency. It is the term for the state of 2 fields that have been in close proximity long enough to stop interfering with each other. It is not reading, it is not connection in the way Kethari understand connection. It is something more basic, the way 2 instruments in the same room will gradually tune to each other if played long enough, not through intention but through proximity and repetition and the simple physics of being in the same air. I had never experienced settled frequency with a human. I had not thought it was possible with a human. The disorganized chaos of a human field was supposed to prevent it. Don's field was not disorganized. It had never been disorganized. I had read it wrong at the start, because I was using the wrong template, the way you read a word wrong when you are expecting a different word, and your brain fills in what it expects. What I had been calling dense and low and organized was, I understood now, simply settled. His own frequency, running at its baseline, undisturbed because he was, in the specific way that mattered to my biology, not disturbing. I had been waiting for the static that never came. That evening I asked him the question I had been holding since week 2, the one I had moved past every time it came close to the surface, because asking it felt like opening a door I had not decided to open yet. It was late. The station was in its quiet cycle. We were both in the operations room because we both stayed late on Tuesday nights when the weekly report compilation ran, and it was easier to cross-reference in real time than to send documents back and forth. I said, "Why do humans move toward things that are dangerous?" He did not answer immediately. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking, present, not stalling. He said, "I don't think most of us do." I said, "You do." He looked at me. His field did that moving thing, the one that was not in my template, the one that went upward. He said, "I guess somebody has to." I sat with that. The quiet in the room was the comfortable kind. Outside, the corridor dark went on in all directions, unremarkable and enormous. I thought about the memorial wall. 47 Kethari names on the left, 12 human names on the right. I thought about 19 hours. I thought about the math of a situation that said to pull back, and 12 people who had looked at the math and decided it was not a thing they were going to accept, because somebody had to hold it. I said, "There were 47 of my people behind the Kereth corridor line." He went still. I said, "I have their names memorized, all 47. He said, "I know." I looked at him. He said, "I looked them up when I got the assignment. I couldn't pronounce most of them. I practiced anyway." I did not know what to do with this. I held it the way I had held the folded treaty document, carefully, with attention to the geometry, trying to understand the shape of it. He said, "It seemed like the right thing." I said, "The 12 human names." He said, "Yeah, I knew 2 of them." The field off him was, "I did not have the word. I am not certain I have ever had the word." It was low and level, and underneath it something that was very old and very quiet, the way grief that has been carried a long time goes quiet. It does not leave. It goes somewhere below the surface where it can be carried without needing to be explained. I recognized it because I carry 47 names the same way. I said, "I am sorry." He said, "Yeah." A pause. Me too. We sat in the operations room with the screens cycling their overnight checks, and the corridor dark, doing its enormous quiet nothing outside, and neither of us said anything else, and the silence was not empty. I did not go back to my quarters for another hour. When I did not reorganize anything. I sat on the edge of my bunk in the way I sat when I needed to think, hands quiet in my lap, and I let myself hold the full weight of what I was beginning to understand. I had arrived at this posting dreading a category, dreading the word human the way you dread a medical diagnosis before you understand what it means, the label covering something you have not yet seen clearly. What I had found was not a category. What I had found was 11 out of 11 tactical decisions made in the same window. Tea at the right temperature. A repair schedule filed in my format. The name of a card game that has irrational rules until you find the internal logic. A field that ran low and settled and did not scatter. That had been this way the whole time while I was waiting for the chaos that never arrived. The dread was still there, technically, but it had changed shape in a way that made it unrecognizable as dread. I had looked for it when I sat down and I could not find it where I had left it. Something else was in the place where the dread had been. Something I did not have a word for. I was working on it. I lay down, I looked at the ceiling. Outside, the void was doing its beautiful nothing. I thought settled frequency. I thought somebody has to. I thought about 12 names he had practiced in private, because it seemed like the right thing. I fell asleep holding something I could not name, which was, I was beginning to understand, exactly how you know it is real. The orders came through on a morning in the 3rd week of the 16th month. I saw them at 06:10, before the coffee cycle had finished, before Don had come in from his hull inspection. I read them twice, which was not because they were unclear. They were clear. They were the clearest thing in the room. New postings. Different sectors. The treaty fulfilled. Cooperative protocol complete. Report to transit within the standard window. Separate transits. Separate sectors. The formal language of an ending that had already been decided. I sat with the orders on my screen. The operations room was quiet around me. The corridor outside was running its early cycle, pale and steady. I read the orders a 3rd time, not because the 3rd time would change them, but because I had not figured out what to do with my hands yet. He had a coffee cup in each hand, which he had been doing most mornings for the past 4 months without any formal arrangement, and he set one on my console the way he always did, and then he looked at the screen. He read it from across the room. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "When did they send it?" I said, "Overnight." He nodded once. He went to his console and pulled up his own copy, which I knew he had, because the system flagged all mission-critical documentation to both terminals simultaneously. He read it. He set his coffee down. He said, "How long is your transit?" I said, 9 days to Cathari Central Station, 11 to the new posting from there. He said, "I'm 7 to the base, then reassignment from there." I said yes. We were quiet for a moment. The systems ran their morning cycle. The corridor was pale and steady and unremarkable. He said, "I'll start the transition files this morning." I said, "I'll handle the dual documentation. Cooperative protocol sign-off requires both signatures on the closing report." He said, "Yeah," in a tone that meant he knew that and was not thinking about the closing report. I was not thinking about the closing report either. I filed it 3 days later, all 40 pages, dual signed, formatted correctly, with full mission documentation and an operational assessment that used words like highly effective joint tactical unit and exceptional cooperative protocol adherence. Official words, true words, words that were approximately as accurate as a map is accurate, capturing the shape of something without being the thing itself. The equipment manifest I had built over 16 months was already in good order. I updated it once more, adding the final month's inventory adjustments, and formatted it in the joint system we had settled into somewhere around month 4. Cathari cataloging structure with his intuitive navigation formatting, which was easier to use in low-light conditions and which I had admitted to myself was objectively better than mine alone. I transferred custody of the system to the incoming assignment team's documentation package with a notation that the format was developed under Joint Operational Protocol and should be maintained as is. I packed in the evening. 2 cases, mission kit. The treaty document was in the inner pocket of my jacket, where it had been since I folded it on the transit ship 16 months ago. I had not refolded it since month 2. It had a slight imperfection in the left crease that I had identified on day 1 of the assignment and had never corrected. I was not going to correct it now. Don was already packed. He had packed in approximately 20 minutes on day 2, the way he had packed in 40 minutes on day 1 of the assignment, because he traveled light in the specific way of someone who has learned that what you carry determines what you are able to move. On the last evening we ran the final systems check together, the same way we had been running the morning systems check together since month 1. The station was in good shape. The outer relay we had repaired in month 3 had held without any further degradation. The sensor array was calibrated. The defensive systems were at full capacity. We handed over a station that was better than the one we had inherited, which is the only honest measure of whether you did your job. We stood in the operations room when it was done. The screens were cycling their overnight checks. The corridor outside was dark and unremarkable and enormous, the way it always was, the way it would be long after both of us had gone to wherever the orders were sending us. I had a speech prepared. I had been preparing something since the orders came through, iterating on it in the quiet of my quarters, finding the right diplomatic framing for the end of a professional assignment, appropriate acknowledgement of effective cooperation, recognition of the mission outcomes, formal and correct. I stood in the operations room, and I looked at him, and the speech dissolved somewhere between my thought and my mouth, and what came out instead was this. I said, "Your field." I could not read it. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had always been good at waiting, in the patient way that was not passive, the waiting of someone who is present and paying attention and not in any hurry to fill silence with something lesser. I said, "From the first day, every human I have ever encountered, their bioelectric field scatters. It is loud, disorganized. I cannot find a pattern in it. That is simply what human fields are, from a Cathari perspective, noise." He was still. His field was doing the thing it always did, low and settled, and organized in a way I had spent 16 months trying to correctly classify. I said, "Yours did not scatter." I kept trying to read it the way I read human fields, expecting the noise, and it was not there. I thought there was something wrong with my field sense. I ran diagnostics twice in month 1. Something moved through his field then. The frequency that went upward, unguarded. I said, I stopped needing to read it. That is the thing I am trying to say. I stopped needing to read it because I already knew. He looked at me for a moment. The room was quiet. He said, "Yeah." Not fair enough. Just yeah. The field behind it was open in a way that I had only read off him once before, in the operations room in month 4, when I had told him I was sorry about the 2 names he had known on the Kareth corridor wall, and he had said me too. I read it clearly, for the first time, once. I had not thought that was possible. I had not thought his field would ever resolve into something I could name. But it did, in that moment, and what it said was nothing complicated. What it said was, "I know. I see you. This was real." Then the moment passed, and the reading closed the way a frequency closes. Not gone, just no longer being broadcast. And that was correct. Some things are said once in a specific moment, and do not need to be said again. He picked up his bag. He said, "Safe transit." I said, "And to you." He walked to the dock. I stood in the operations room for another minute, not for any operational reason, just standing in the space we had occupied for 16 months. The joint filing system was running its overnight sync. The equipment manifest was updated and transferred. The closing report was filed. I looked at the empty console where his coffee cup had been every morning. Then I picked up my cases and walked to my dock. The transit ship was smaller than the last one and louder, and I did not sleep well for the first 3 days. which I attributed to the engine frequency and not to anything else, which was only approximately true. I ran through the mission documentation on day 4. I reviewed the closing report. I read every line of the 40 pages, all the official language, all the accurate but insufficient words. I read my own operational assessment of Don Morrow, which said things like, demonstrates exceptional tactical judgment and highly compatible decision-making profile under pressure, and which was true in the way that a map is true, capturing the shape without being the thing. On day 5, I wrote a personal log entry that I had been avoiding writing. I wrote it for 20 minutes and then deleted all of it except the last 2 lines, which were 11 out of 11, settled frequency. I stared at those 2 lines for a while. Then I added a third. I should have taken the ration packet on day 1. I closed the log. On day 7, I received a standard transit acknowledgement from Federation Routing, the automated confirmation that my departure from the Veth corridor posting had been logged, and my arrival at Keth Ari Central was expected on schedule. On day 8, I received a second message, not from Federation Routing, no listed sender, just a sequence of numbers that resolved, when I ran them through the stellar cartography system, into coordinates. I sat with the coordinates on my screen for a long time. The sector they pointed to was not one I had been assigned to. It was a sector I knew from mission briefings and from the specific strategic pattern of Dravathi movement along the corridor's eastern edge, a sector that mattered, that was being watched, that was about to become the kind of place that needed the kind of people who run toward things. No message, just coordinates. I knew what the coordinates meant. I knew what they were asking without asking, in the specific language of someone who had spent 16 months learning how I worked and knew that I would read it correctly. I filed an inquiry with the Transit Authority, a formal request to review my routing assignment in light of a newly identified strategic requirement in an adjacent sector. The inquiry was politely worded and entirely correct in its procedural framing. I wrote the mission justification in 4 hours. It was thorough, it was accurate, it cited the Dravathi movement patterns along the eastern edge with the kind of specific data that only someone who had been paying very close attention for a very long time would have. It cited cooperative protocol outcomes and the established operational framework of joint tactical units. It cited, in the neutral language of official documentation, the value of established tactical familiarity in high-pressure frontier postings. I filed the inquiry. I set down my handheld unit. I looked out the transit window at the stars, which were doing their patient and unremarkable nothing. I did not think about the field I had read once, clearly, in the operations room on the last night. I did not think about tea brought at the right temperature without asking, or 11 out of 11, or 47 names and 12 more, or the way 2 instruments in the same room will gradually tune to each other if played long enough. I did not think about what the dread had turned into, in the place where dread had been, the thing I still did not have a word for and had not stopped looking for a word for. I thought, instead, about a sector at the eastern edge of the corridor where someone was holding a line because somebody had to, and about coordinates sent without a message because some things do not need explaining if you are sending them to someone who will understand. I pulled up the mission justification and read it once more. It was good, it was honest, it made a clear case. I filed the mission report. I noted the Veth corridor assignment as operationally complete. I left out the 47 names. I left out the 12. I left out 11 out of 11 and settled frequency and the sound of a laugh in an operations room late at night, unguarded, going upward. Some things you do not put in a report. Some things you carry. You carry them the way you carry names you have memorized in the quiet of your quarters with the lights low. Not because anyone told you to, not because anyone would know if you stopped, but because they are the weight of something real, and you have decided that real things deserve to be carried. The transit continued. The stars did their patient nothing. I had an inquiry pending with the Transit Authority and a mission justification filed and coordinates on my screen that pointed east. I sat with my hands quiet in my lap, which is the Cathari position for thinking that you do not want anyone to see you doing. I thought, somebody has to. I thought, yes. I thought, that can be me.